Tonight we're going to talk about ritual healing and the belief in miracles. And our reading that we'll begin with is from the Gospel according to Monty Python. And so, I don't know if you remember from the movie The Life of Brian, Brian and his mother are kind of just walking through the streets, and there is a bunch of beggars, and one of the beggars says, "Alms for an old ex-leper." And at a certain point, Brian says, "Did you say ex-leper?" "That's right, sir, 16 years behind the bell and proud of it." "Well, what happened?" "I was cured, sir." "Cured?" "Yes, a bloody miracle, sir, God bless you." "Who cured you?" "Jesus did, sir. I was hopping along, minding my own business. All of a sudden up he comes, cures me. 1 minute I'm a leper with a trade, next minute my livelihood's gone. Not so much as a buy or leave. You're cured, mate, bloody do-gooder." "Well," Brian says thoughtfully, "why don't you go and tell him you want to be a leper again?" And the ex-leper says, "Oh, yeah, I could do that, sir. Yeah, I could do that, I suppose. What I was thinking was, I was going to ask him if he could make me a bit lame in one leg during the middle of the week. Something beggable, but not leprosy, which is a pain in the arse. To be blunt, excuse my French, sir." So anyway. And then after a little bit more, ultimately, Brian puts a coin in his bowl. There you are. And he says, "Thank you, sir, thanks." And then he sees what it is. "Half a denari for me bloody life story." And Brian says, "There's no pleasing some people. That's just what Jesus said, sir." All right. So ritual healing. So that is one of the parody anyway that's taken from accounts in the canonical Gospels of the Christian New Testament. So the Gospel according to Luke. There is a story that on the way to Jerusalem, Luke writes, Jesus was going through the region between Samaria and Galilee, so the northern parts of the land. As he entered a village, 10 lepers approached him. Keeping their distance, they called out, saying, "Jesus, Master, have mercy on us." When he saw them, he said to them, "Go and show yourselves to the priests." And as they went, they were made clean. Then one of them, when he saw that he was healed, turned back, praising God with a loud voice. He prostrated himself at Jesus' feet and thanked him. And he was a Samaritan. And Jesus asked, "Were there not 10 made clean, but the other 9, where are they? Was none of them found to return and give praise to God except this foreigner?" And so you may remember from the parable of the Good Samaritans that the Judeans and the Jews and the Samaritans are rivals. And so he said, then he said to him, "Get up and go on your way. Your faith has made you well." So this is a canonical example of a faith healing, and it's of the same kind of variety that the Monty Python is making fun of, right? So there's another account in the earlier gospel, the Gospel of Mark. I want to explain a little bit a different version of how you do a faith healing. So they came to Bethsaida. Some people brought a blind man to him, Jesus, and begged him to touch him. He took the blind man by the hand and led him out of the village. And when he had put saliva on his eyes and laid his hands on him, he asked, "Can you see anything?" And the man looked up and said, "I can see people, but they look like trees walking." And then Jesus laid his hand on his eyes again, and he looked intently, and his sight was restored, and he saw everything clearly. So as opposed to the last one, where it was where Jesus actually. So in both cases, actually, it's kind of an interesting thing that Jesus does. He doesn't take a wand and go, boom, you're cured. In the first case, he has them go do something, which is to say, show themselves to the authorities, right? So the priests. So it's not challenging the authority of for example, the Jewish priests, and instead, by going and doing that thing, they're healed. And in this case, there's something that's more like a ritual magic practice where you have something like saliva, and you also have laying of hands, right? So, historical Jesus. This image here is a modern reconstruction, maybe, of what the historical Jesus looked like, according to some scholars who are doing sort of genetics of what people in Palestine at the time would look like, as opposed to the Anglo-Saxon romantic Jesuses that we have from the 19th century paintings. So all 4 of the canonical Gospels and many early Gospels that did not make it into the New Testament depict Jesus as a faith healer. In our only and still contentious almost contemporary source that's not Christian, that is talking about the historical Jesus, Josephus, in a potentially uncontaminated part of his text. That's in dispute whether this is the case or whether it's all Christian interpolation. In any event, that section calls Jesus one who wrought surprising feats, as opposed to if a Christian maybe were interpolating it, they might write, I don't know, one who performed many miracles or something like that. This is a person who does feats, maybe. And there are plenty of contemporaries, we should note, of Jesus who are going around working surprising feats. So even though we maybe are only familiar with a couple texts that are very famous out of the first century of the Common Era, nevertheless, if we were to go through all of the texts, all of the ancient texts, this kind of thing is happening all the time. And there's plenty of miracle workers who are healers and faith healers and things like that. And so it definitely fits into a contemporary context. It's not making Jesus unique among people in his time period. So I would suggest then, and many scholars of the historical Jesus do, I think almost all, that if we're going to tick off the couple components that we can kind of be more sure of about the historical Jesus, which are things like he's from Nazareth, he has disciples, he got crucified. If we are going to kind of list off those kind of things, then that he is a faith healer or a worker, has a reputation for performing wonders, is one of the things that is multiply attested, and that probably anyway goes back to the historical Jesus. So in that context, we could say the context, Jesus is raised in the context of Second Temple Judaism, which is to say that Judaism that existed after the original destruction of Jerusalem, the destruction of Solomon's temple, after the temple is rebuilt. And at this time in Jesus' day, it's been rebuilt again by Herod the Great, and so it's called Herod's temple, anyway, the second temple. And prior to the destruction of that temple by the Romans about 40 years later, and then therefore long before the origin or the actual institutionalization of rabbinic Judaism, of which nearly all branches, with just one tiny little exception, of all Judaism that exists today is descended from rabbinic Judaism. So before the sort of codification of rabbinic Judaism, this Second Temple period, that era of Judaism included lots of different perspectives. There were many different kinds of different ways to be an adherent of Judaism. And they don't all agree with each other. In fact, they were often violently in disagreement with each other about how to do it. But many of them believed in faith healing. So this is also a very contemporary belief in that era of Judaism. And there were all kinds of scriptural examples that Second Temple Jews could be drawing on. So for example, from the First Temple period, the scripture is talking about things like the Nehushtan here, which is this bronze serpent on a pole that, according to the story of the Exodus, it was Moses himself who raised that up in order to heal the people of a disease. And more importantly, maybe in terms of a actual historical component to this object, at the time of King Josiah, that object that was attributed to Moses continued to exist as a cult object that was used for healing contemporaneously. And because of the religious reforms that took place at the time of Josiah, the king actually destroyed this object, which had been Moses' object, because it was believed to be part of pagan worship at this point. So in other words, ritual healing as paganism. But there were also then stories like, for example, of a literary prophet, Elijah, who goes and does miraculous healing feats. And so those are used as a very direct model by the author, for example, of Luke, who reworks some of those stories to create Jesus healing stories, for example. And other examples being the book of Tobit, which didn't make it ultimately into the rabbinic Jewish canon, but was very popular and circulating at this time in Second Temple Judaism. There is a tale within it of the angel Raphael, one of the archangels, the angel of healing, who cures blindness, a person blindness, Tobit, of blindness using the gall of kind of a magic fish, and so the gallbladder. And so it's much like, again, that kind of practice where Jesus is taking saliva or a little bit of mud and things like that and using that as a component of kind of a ritual magic healing, in this case a magic fish's gallbladder, right? So that's the context within Second Temple Judaism a little bit. But there's another context that Jesus, and then especially Christianity after Jesus, gets to. So it was just last year, yeah. So last fall during September break, we were in Arles, and one of the things, and this is in southern France, and so one of the things that Arles has is this amazing collection of early Christian sarcophagi from the 4th century, the biggest that anybody has outside of the Vatican. And these are, in fact, among the earliest depictions that we have of Jesus. So there's nothing from the 1st century, certainly, or 2nd century, or anything like that. It's only when Christianity really takes off and frankly, rich people start to be Christians that they start making pictures and start having, they can afford sarcophagi, right? So what's happening here in this particular sarcophagus is, so the person is in a coffin here, right? And so then there's images on either side here, 6, and there's one in the middle. And so each one of them has Jesus. So Jesus here is the one on the left in each case, and then on this side, the one on the right in each case. And you can see he's got a toga, and he's got a magic stick here. And what he's doing in each case is performing a miracle. So whether or not it's turning water into wine, it's primarily healing. And so in this case, he's raising someone from the dead. He's getting the woman with osteoporosis cured. He's curing a blind man and a cripple, right? And so then what's happening in the middle is he's also resurrecting the dead, right? And so the idea of it is this rich woman who is in here, she is going to be resurrected because of her faith in Jesus, right? And so that's what they're showing in these sarcophagi, and there's plenty of them. One of the interesting things about all these is there's very little difference, in this 4th century depiction of Jesus than, let's say, a 4th century depiction of Asclepius or Apollo, who are both called the healer as a designation. So Asclepius the healer, Apollo the healer. This Jesus here, looks very, and they would have these sticks. They look very much like the same. So the model for this, they don't have some kind of picture of Jesus that they're working from, for sure. And in fact, no one does. Rather, what's happening here is they have as their model a healing god, a young healing god, Apollo. And so Jesus is being depicted in that way. So while faith healing is part of that Second Temple Judaism tradition, Galilee, where Jesus is from, actually had been Hellenized for many, many centuries. And of course, it was part of the Roman Empire and early Christianity anyway. So however much that actually affected the historical Jesus, it was critically important as Christianity expanded into the Roman Empire and quickly beyond its Jewish roots into to convert Greek and Latin pagans. And when it did that, it had all of the faith healing traditions of Greek and Latin paganism to draw from that religion, which included all sorts of ritual healing and healing gods like this. And so, like I say, Jesus here is depicted almost exactly like Apollo the healer, and again, he even has the staff. That's not in the text. There's no talking about, we read it as we were reading it. It's not like Jesus took his staff and did these things, but this is the kind of thing that Asclepius has, right?
Any idea what the birds are doing up there?
They're being decorative, I think. I don't know. It's, so.
John, remember you have to repeat the question.
Okay, the question was, what are the birds doing up there? And so there's birds, and I just think they're being decorative. So I think that this is a traditional trope of how to make a sarcophagus and to make the different vignettes. And so this is another one of the sarcophagi, and so this again is Jesus. And so where's the beard, right? so of course Apollo doesn't have a beard. And so these earliest depictions don't, when Jesus is going, in this case is Jesus the teacher, so he's got a book that he's teaching from. And so they usually have then, when he's running around as in his actual ministry before the crucifixion, they have him in the guise of essentially Apollo or a young god like that. And so he's an unbearded man wearing a Roman toga. But then, when he gets resurrected, this is the same sarcophagi here. So now suddenly the beard comes in. And so what's happened is that now that he is no longer a young miracle worker, God running around the planet for the Romans, and so now Romans understand him to be God reigning in heaven, so now he has the same image of Zeus. And so Shaheen has a question.
More of a comment.
Leandra, is that on?
No.
Here?
Oh, there's no light.
Yeah, well, I'll have to. Oh, there's no light there?
No. Is there a button on the side somewhere that I can press?
Can I see? Oh. I'm blaming this on urgent.
That's not fair. All right, here we go.
Oh, okay. There's feedback. Okay. It was more of a comment. So this whole thing of, Jesus pre-resurrection being this beardless youth and then post-resurrection being a bearded man, there's a lot of tribes in which rites of passage
Yeah.
that young men would undergo would involve a death of the old self.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I'm wondering if this is just some of that same old, just
Yeah.
rehashed.
Yeah. So it's interesting, right? Because when we went and looked at all these sarcophagi, I was really struck by this because I was like, I was ready for them to not have beards because that was very common. But then I'm like, wait a second, these Jesuses up in heaven do have beards, and so it is kind of an interesting thing. I mean, like you say. So I have been just reading, for example, a lot of those sorts of coming of age practices in the history of ancient Rome, and so there is this there's very famous one. So the Romans saw themselves; they saw as the wolf is a sacred animal. Romulus and Remus are cast out of a basket and onto the river, and just like Moses, but found and then ultimately suckled by a she-wolf, right? And so that's one of the famous things. And the idea of it is that then they've gone off into the wild, and they've been wild young men. They're brigands, they're pirates, and all this kind of thing. And it's then they come back into society, and have to found a city and get wives and all that kind of thing. But that is ceremonially recreated year after year after year in the ancient Romans at the February festival of the Lupercalia. And so in the Lupercalia, they do this thing where the young men of that age, they essentially have sent them out ritually to be living as wild wolves, and so they run around they start at the Lupercalia shrine in Rome. They are dressed only in a wolf skin loincloth or on the wolf on the top or whatever it is, and they have thongs of hide, goat hide I think, or whatever, that they are running around with and whipping all the young women with, as they're running around the whole circuit of the town. And the idea of it is that these are the young men who have gone out and been living as wild wolves, and now they are going to become, all those wild ways are going away, and they're going to be, adult men. And of course, then it's also a fertility ritual and everything like that. And that was so popular that, like hundreds of years into Christianity, the popes still couldn't get them to stop doing that every year, and so they ultimately replaced it with the festival of the purification of the Blessed Virgin, and so then that's held at the same time, and that's now where Valentine's Day is, right? And so that's why we have a love letters or whatever, because the popes couldn't get people to stop doing this. But anyway, to your point, that's exactly the kind of thing that's happening, and there's all sorts of those holdovers, because the immediate context for all of Romans are that they're familiar with those stories, they're familiar with that kind of rituals, they're familiar with this imagery. The early Christians are not coming with any imagery, and so it's hard to replace something with nothing. And so when when you're wanting to fill in the art, if you don't have anything ready, they take the models at hand. So this is why, then, the portrait that many Christians have in their head today, what they imagine God literally looks like in some kind of real literal sense, they are actually looking at Zeus, right? And so if Zeus were wearing a tunic. He's a little more modest now as God than he was as Zeus. But if you were wondering if God is ripped, the answer is yes. So, when he didn't wear his tunic back in the old days. Okay. So, medieval Christians then inherited then both those Jewish and pagan ritual healing, faith healing traditions. And this is a picture of the different Canterbury pilgrims getting ready for the Canterbury Tales. And so if you remember from the prologue, I love this a lot. We had to memorize this in high school. So pricketh him natur in hier courages, then longen folk to goen on pilgrimages, and palmers for to seken strange estranges, to ferne haules coeth in sundry londes, and specially from every sheeras ende of England to Canterbury they vende, the holy blissful martyr for to seke, that hem hath holpen one that they were seke. And so they are wanting to go on pilgrimage at this time of year, and they want to go to distant shrines in various lands from every shire's end of England. They go to Canterbury, where Thomas à Becket is, where he as a martyr is known to be able to heal people who need to go on these pilgrimages. They are going then to seek the holy blessed martyr who helped them when they were sick. So this is just a regular tradition. It's worked right into the main piece of medieval Middle English literature. Okay, so that tradition continues. And we'll mention that here in Toronto Centre Place, we have in our heritage room, we have this set of stained glass windows that are from our old building, 2 buildings back when we were on Soho Street. That building was built in 1906. And so we preserved stained glass windows from it and brought it along with us. And what it's narrating here, it's again a Jesus without a beard, really, right? So it's kind of a very androgynous Jesus, right? So why is that stuck? Okay. So he laid his hands on her, and immediately she was made straight and glorified God. Luke 13:13 is what the caption reads. And so this is specifically meant to be a depiction, ostensibly, of Jesus healing a woman with osteoporosis. But the particular image was actually chosen in 1906. They were commemorating an event that took place in the congregation in the 1890s. This young woman then, Minnie Falls, this is her later, half a century later, in 1948. She had always, from early childhood, worn a brace and had used a crutch. And then there was, in 1890s, just a very famous faith healing in the congregation. And then afterwards, she never used either. And she continued to testify that until, well into like I say, the middle of the 20th century. And that had been a very important part of the congregation's story and understanding of itself back then. And I'll just mention that in our particular tradition in Community of Christ, we have 8 sacraments. And so, there are things like baptism, confirmation, blessing of children, communion, and then here, laying on of hands for the sick. And so laying on of hands for the sick is one of 8 special sacraments that we continue to maintain as a sacrament in our denomination. And so if we read from my own church's website, then it says, during times of physical, mental, or emotional distress, people may seek this sacrament from ministers. This sacrament opens a way for healing in whatever form it comes, unquote. So I'll also say then, from my personal experience as a minister, I've been called upon numerous times to perform this sacrament. We use our jargon, we call it administration. I don't know why that should be called administration, but anyway, that's very jargony, right? So from my perspective, I always see this as a sacrament of spiritual healing. And specifically what we're doing is expressing that the individual is part of a community that values and loves them. And indeed, they're of inestimable worth in the sight of God. But I have also then, every time I've been called upon to do it, I found it to just be an amazingly moving and powerful experience when you are saying a blessing of support and comfort and healing, spiritual healing, and being in physical contact with someone. So this is in fact not an administration. This is a different sacrament, but it looks exactly the same. We don't usually take pictures of administration, and so this is a confirmation, but this is what it would look like, is what I'm suggesting here. So the website says, usually 2 elders administer the sacrament together. They visit with the person to find out more about the person's need. One elder places a drop of consecrated oil on the forehead of the person, places the hands on the person's head, and offers a statement of purpose and blessing. The second elder then places the hands on the person's head and offers a prayer for wholeness and well-being. And so that's essentially what that sacrament is.
That's not you, is it?
That's me.
I believe it.
Okay. So this was after I had my bike accident and broke my arm. So yeah, I was in need of administration for spiritual healing, but for OHIP, for physical healing. And so the Ontario Health Administration. So this, I'm going to now talk about my own. I've now revealed my own personal background as a faith healer, But I'm also going to talk a little bit here about my bias. So my bias is that the responsible use of faith healing as a practice does need to emphasize the spiritual, or therefore non-material aspect of it, the person's connection to God and community, and it doesn't make pronouncements like, if you have faith, you will be cured of your cancer, which is the kind of thing that sometimes happens in faith healings, as a person will make those kind of pronouncements. I also find it to be, now that's responsible use, irresponsible, for example, when a faith healer, let's say, blames the victim for insufficient faith. So the person who, they've been told that they will have their cancer cured of them if they believe, and then the cancer isn't being cured, and so it's obvious that it's the person's fault for insufficient faith. And then much worse, if they also are in this place where they're saying, well, if you're going to an actual doctor, that shows you don't have faith, which unfortunately also happens in some of the more fundamentalistic versions of faith healing. So, by way of that background, I'll just say, going all the way back, disease and injuries and everything else have been with us since prehistoric times. And so that goes all the way back. However, the reality is that effective medicine is an extremely recent modern phenomenon. There were things that were effective that physicians did, but not in any kind of comprehensive way. And so really, the kind of miraculous modern medicine is in the 20th and 21st centuries, but it starts kind of going for real in the 19th century only. So this is, anyway, from my perspective as a medievalist, that's pretty recent stuff. So, Elizabeth has a comment.
Yeah, my tutor in college once remarked that it was only at about 1890 that it became having a doctor attend to you made it more rather than less likely that you would get better.
Right. Yeah, and I think that can be the case. So even though in the 19th century the doctors knew better what they were doing, nevertheless it was still early times, and so there was lots more promise of medicine, but there was still lots of failure, like a huge failure rate compared to what we have now. And so as a result of that, there's actually the late 19th and early 20th centuries is actually one of these moments in the West of huge uptick in spiritual healing and faith healing. And so actually almost all of the faith healing that we are familiar with now, as you're thinking about Pentecostals, Christian Science, all of those kind of things, that all emerges out of that time period when people are clued into the promise of modern medicine, but modern medicine isn't always getting the results that they wanted, and so they are doing things like, specifically in my congregation too, many faults, right? So they've got these braces and crutches and things like that in some cases are causing more pain than they're helping at that time period with the technology that they have. And there's all these faith healings where they throw the crutches and braces away, and that's the kind of thing that's that's emerging. And so there's way more of it, frankly, at this time period that medicine is getting going than there was even before. So to Elizabeth's point here, I think I'm even going to say what she just said. So although, anyway, there have been high culture traditions across Eurasia, so it's the theory of the humors in the West And so humorism it's called, but there's also a whole elaborated system, for example, in China, Chinese medicines, acupuncture, that kind of thing. Those are based on very sophisticated ideas and philosophies, and then they're extraordinarily elaborated. So you see maybe with acupuncture, you see all these diagrams and everything like that. We have that same thing going on in the West with humorism. So all of we make fun of bloodletting and things like that now, but it's really the same level of thing, which is to say there is an old philosophical idea behind there that is not the same as modern medicine in terms of being tested with a scientific method and that kind of a thing. Anyway, so their aggressive intervention, as to Elizabeth's point, by physicians was often just as likely to harm the patient as help the patient. And so there's plenty of people in history who ultimately the bloodletting, is what's killed them, right? Anyway, given the environment of the past, there has always been a market for healing. People have always been ill and they've wanted to have healing. And so given the fact that physicians then are not helping very much in the past, requests for intervention from higher powers, be it in a society that's animistic, spirits, gods for pagans, God for monotheists, that extends all the way back into prehistory as well. And if you actually, Valerie.
We should perhaps mention too that for a time the knowledge and practice of medicine in Islamic lands, especially in the High Middle Ages, was far advanced to anything that was going on in Europe.
Yes.
To a certain degree because they had preserved Greek learning on the matter and advanced it, but also because they were open to experimentation and evidence-based medicine.
Yes, so they had both aspects of it in Islam, right? And so the medieval, when I talk about here, the humorism, when we're talking about the four humors, whether you're melancholic and colic and all the different biles and bloods and sanguine, those ideas go all the way back to the ancient Greeks, Aristotle, Galen, all of these very famous physicians. But it was largely only known in a little bit of abridgment in the West. And so it became very studied, and it's the center of Islamic medicine as the Muslims translate all of that Greek learning into Arabic. And so then that becomes the basis for, medieval Islamic medicine, which translates through Spain and through both the Muslim and Jewish physicians into the Western Europe, and so that's where they get it from. But meanwhile, to Valerie's point, they also have some of the very earliest scientific method kind of stuff going on. For example, the treatise on optics by, is it Razi? And so he is, that's really then, he's working on the eye, and although he doesn't quite get it right exactly, what he does do in these very elaborate studies, he begins to create the modern scientific method. And so then out of that is where we do start to get the beginnings, the proto-beginnings. We're still not to the point where anything that the physicians are doing is better than halfway going to cure or not cure you, but in any event, this is also, it's causing that, it's on the one hand that humorism, which is to say this high philosophical but not scientifically helpful type of traditional high Western Islamic, Greek, and medieval Latin medicine, but it also is the beginnings of that scientific method that's going to eventually give birth to modern medical science. And so Shaheen has a comment on that.
I'd like to add that along with this, emphasis on actually using like medical systems, there is still a very strong aspect of faith healing. So, for example, similar to Moses' rod, or Jesus laying on hands or using saliva. In the Quran, for example, in the Surah of Joseph, Jacob goes blind with grief when he thinks that Joseph has died. Yeah. And so when Joseph's brothers are returning to Jacob, he sends his shirt with them. And he tells them to lay his shirt on his father and his sight will be restored.
Oh, okay. Very good, yeah.
And along with that as well is that in other aspects of faith healing is that it's very widespread in, Islamic culture to have things like a protective amulet, which will contain like a miniature copy of the Quran or surahs of the Quran.
Oh,
And
okay.
where does
Yeah.
where does a protective amulet? It's a
Yeah.
taweez. And also that in some cases people believed that if you wrote the words of the Quran and then washed the ink off the page and then drank that water, that would heal you of your remedies. So
Oh, wow.
it's just
Okay.
as much of a mix.
Yeah. So there's, on the one hand, the high, well, there's a couple things, the high ancient Greek philosophical type of medicine that's traditional, the beginnings of scientific medicine, but then also what we might think of as faith healing, through different types of physical magic kind of things to do, but although obviously taken in a edifying the Quran. In other words, we're saying we're not finding some kind of outside source. The source from God is Quran, right? And so that's where maybe you're drinking the magic of that, or the power, the miracle. Yes.
Yeah, I just wanted to also mention a few things. In Islam, for example, there's the science of hadith, which is what the Prophet says to people and guides them through. Some of the hadith are called hadith Qudsi. That is the words of God, right away written as hadith. So it's not the words of the Prophet, it's words from God. And one of them encourages people to seek help, medical help, while still says it's like God's willing that you get healed. So
Okay.
people ask the Prophet, then what is the point? Who's the doctor?
Yeah.
What does a doctor mean, or where do they?
Yeah, that's a good question.
Yeah,
What does the prophet say?
and the answer is it's someone through whom healing is sent to you, something like
okay.
that. So the doctor, even the doctor in modern medicine,
Yeah.
is portrayed as sort of a vehicle
Yeah.
where you can seek modern medicine. It's just combining the two schools of knowledge, if
Yeah,
you
yeah.
would.
Well, what I would, in terms of the characterization I had just made, then I would call that more responsible faith healing, as opposed to less, right? Because because we're not saying if you go and seek the physician, that means you didn't think that God was going to do it for you, or or something like that, or you're denying God's power to perform a miracle. And that obviously can have just disastrous results when a religious group or a society decides they're going to go down that way. I mean, to an extent, I think the Christian Scientists are kind of in that sometimes, because they are so focused on a particular kind of faith healing that if they go and have certain kinds of medical procedures, they're going against their beliefs, which makes they have a belief that's more dangerous as a result.
I found this interesting because it's contrary to that thinking that it's either or.
Yeah, no, I like that.
It's complementary.
Yes.
And another point I wanted to mention is, even if we look into the ancient books of medicine, I mean, while I'm a medical doctor, I do respect and understand spiritual healing.
Yes.
My mom's grandfather used to do this. He's sort of he has his own knowledge of Quran and so on.
Yeah.
He tries not to do it, he just encourages people to do their own reading and carry on with their lives in a good way.
Yeah.
But I have seen him healing. The practice is very similar to the picture you showed, that they put the hands on someone's head and do the healing. But the ancient books of modern medicine portray some horrific images of somebody being held down in a bed.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Surgery being performed without anesthesia.
Oh, yeah, of course.
And as a student of medicine, when I look at this, it's horrific.
Yes. Yeah.
And I think this links to the practices that link healing to suffering,
Yes.
which I still continue to find as really just strange.
Yes.
But some schools say you have to suffer in order to get healed.
Yeah.
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 So,
And that's a very good point. Anyway, thank you for all of that. I appreciate that. So what I will say is, not as a medical doctor who has a faith healer in my own family, but as a historian, when you go back and read ancient texts, history, the kind of historical accounts of things, what you end up finding is ancient people are experiencing, or at least they are saying that they're perceiving that they're experiencing miracles and miracle healing all the time. So it's not just, for example, in my own community here, the historian from the middle of the 20th century who, it's not a trained historian, but anyway, this congregational historian who told that story of many faulds. She's certainly not the first person in history to have experienced a healing miracle, and indeed, they're just everywhere. That's what people talk about. Historians, part of the job of being a modern historian is always to delete out miracles, because that's what the ancient people wanted to write, and that's not part of our worldview, right? So healing from antiquity to late antiquity to medieval to early modern and modern times, it's just all bunches of accounts of that. So in late antiquity especially, authors became really obsessed with miracles, and indeed it's not just Christian saints, so it's not simply this time period that Christianity is emerging and becoming the dominant force in the Roman Empire. In point of fact, for the pagans as well, contemporary paganism is become quite like its Christian rival. And so in the end, the philosophers, natural philosophers, they had to essentially become sorcerers, and this is the idea that we kind of have of where sorcerers come from. They are performing different types of what we think of as supernatural feats and miracle healings and things like that. That's what where the contemporaries of early Christians. So how does science tend to explain all this? We've had a very generous explanation from a medical doctor, but some critics are not as generous, and so there's three kind of general or main accounts for the fact that miracles are all over the place in the historical record, and so a large proportion of these accounts, historians will tell you, are literary, which is to say they are composed by authors who aren't eyewitnesses. And so that's going to be true for all of the canonical Gospels, as we were reading Mark and Luke. Those authors did not witness those miracles. Those are traditions that they're writing down, or in some of the cases we can kind of show with Luke. Luke is actually reworking Old Testament stories and creating New Testament stories. And so there may not be any underlying account at all other than that as a literary source. So it's entirely literary. The next one of those, so in other words, literary creation. The next one is the logical fallacy of post hoc ergo propter hoc, which is, I think, everyone's favorite logical fallacy. I don't know, because we just love saying it so much. Post hoc ergo propter hoc. Anyway, so which is to say, just because this came after that, it doesn't mean that this is on account of that, right? So you did this and that and the other thing in terms of a healing ritual, and then the person was healed. But that doesn't mean that just because the one thing became first, that's the why they were healed, right? You might have done this, that, and the other thing to another person, and then they're not healed, right? And so then that's not causing the consequence, and it's a logical fallacy.
Correlation and causation. All of these
Causation, yes.
things,
Yeah. And that's why people don't have, and that's just how we understand things, kind of if we aren't having recourse to the scientific method, of study. So Sheen has a comment.
Yeah, I just want to add that sometimes the faith healing works not on account of because of something else, but on account of faith. Mm-hmm. And it's not it's something that in pharmaceutical studies and drug studies they call the placebo effect.
That's the third point, as you'll see.
See, I'm blind today, so I can't see that.
Oh, yeah, that's right. Yeah, Shaheen doesn't have her. I need to come and do you want me to spit in your eyes here? I'm going to spit in your eyes. No, I won't do it. Shaheen lost her contacts and doesn't have her glasses. So yes, the third point is, to Shaheen's point, she's exactly right, the placebo effect. So this is the third way that scientists will kind of argue, okay, how do we explain why there have been so many miracle healings? Well, one is that believing that you are going to get better, that can have a real effect. That is measurable. The placebo effect is so strong that you have to have really good medicine in order to be better than placebo. And there's a lot of different practices that are only as good as placebo, because placebo is really good. Valerie has or Sheen can have one more point on placebo.
Yeah. So, like, good examples of how, you know, faith can be a really powerful, can cause observed and objective changes is, for example, like with some women who really want to become pregnant.
Oh yeah, right.
They desire it so much that their bodies undergo fake pregnancies.
Right. Yeah. Right. Like Queen
You know?
Queen Mary the First
Yeah.
of England has
Yeah.
a phantom pregnancy because she needed a child so bad. You
Yeah.
know, I mean, her dad was able to just kill wives, but she doesn't have that option, right? So anyway, wow. Yeah.
Yeah, and-
exactly. So that's a great example. And there's other ones where. You know, the opposite of placebo is nocebo, right? So you've been told that the cancer medicine, you know, it's amazing. This is gonna be finally do it. You know, everything else hasn't worked, but this placebo, but you don't know what it is, you know, is going to cure you. And then it works, but then you find out that no, it was just a phony, and so then, boom, you know, it kills you, right? You gave me that example, Arjun. So yeah.
Yeah, and going back to the pregnancy one, with some men like who are very empathetic towards their wives, when their wives are pregnant, they undergo symptoms of pregnancy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right, sympathetic. Valerie and then Elizabeth, then we'll plow forward.
I'm just thinking too that a certain proportion of such healing effects may be due to an alleviation of what in modern times in psychology and psychiatry might be termed psychosomatic illness.
Right. That's another good.
And it's not quite the same, let's say, as the placebo effect, because
Right.
in the placebo effect there might be an actual illness that somehow is alleviated. But in psychosomatic illness, excuse me, there may be effects that are more imagined than real. Nonetheless, they have an effect. And I was acquainted with a physician for a number of years, a family doctor, who assured me that he felt that a very large number of the patients he saw were in fact suffering from psychosomatic illness, like doctor, my
Yes.
stomach hurts, whatever.
Yes.
And he would suspect that. He would send them to a psychiatrist.
Yes.
There would be some alleviation, but then they'd be back, you know, several months later. He didn't think much of modern psychiatry.
Yes.
And still, doctor, my stomach hurts. Nonetheless, there was no apparent physical basis for it. And I'm wondering whether in the
Possibly
past,
faith healing
you know,
actually
in
is
in
more
faith-based
effective on
times,
psychosomatic illness.
yeah, it might
than-
be even more effective than modern psychiatry
Yeah.
for whatever reason.
Yeah, right.
But that a certain percentage, let's say, of
Right. So if you have a
you know,
psychosomatic illness and it's manifesting, for example, as you think that you're possessed by a demon,
Yeah.
and then you have a healing where the demon is exorcised, that may actually work better than a physician
Yeah,
who
or
thinks there's nothing
the
wrong
demon's
with you.
making the demon
You
is
know?
making your arm hurt.
Right.
And
Yeah.
then
Exactly.
your
Yeah.
arm is
Right.
better.
Yep. And it was Elizabeth, and then Karen.
Oh, yeah, it was just a comment on the, I think it was Luke describing the blind man who was healed. I think it was Oliver Sacks who commented about that passage, that it's accurate that when somebody's blind and they get their sight back, yeah, at first things
yeah.
things don't, they don't know what they're seeing.
Right.
And yes, and that people can look like trees walking. The
Yeah.
other passage that occurred to me is from Somerset Maugham's Of Human Bondage. You may know it. The protagonist has a club foot, and he's told that if his faith is strong enough, it will be healed. And he prays, and his faith is really strong, and he thinks, oh, tomorrow when I wake up, my club foot will be healed. Guess what?
Okay.
So,
Yes,
John,
we've
I
done-
will propose, like, this is a really amazing discussion, but
Yeah.
just for so that everyone knows, there's 50 plus slides left that we
Okay.
would like to go through within
let-
the next 30 minutes. So
Okay, so let's pause on this. I'm sorry, Karen. Let's pause because we have been having a great discussion, but let's get through it and then we can.
and we'll
talk.
save the discussion for the
Yep.
for the end.
Okay, so this is a big topic in scope and size, right? So we have things like this is Our Lady of Lourdes. So pilgrims that are going in a specifically institutional Christian context to be healed, people who have all different injuries going to a shrine. of the Virgin in France. We have, this is Benny Hinn, right? So we have televangelists who do, in his kind of miracle center where he's doing faith healings. We have more traditional faith healers, like you're talking about. Is it your dad or your grandfather? I can't. An ancient one. Oh, okay, an ancient one. I'm sorry. So yes. So anyway, more traditional vernacular healing kind of thing. We have more New Agey kind of healing. So how all the different crystals are let's say, healing you. We have very traditional, as opposed to like the other one being like a monotheistic Christian practice. This is a case of a voodoo practitioner, so indigenous and other, not in this case indigenous, but anyway, in this case Haitian, but anyway, other kinds of traditions like that. We have these ancient, what had been the high cultural ideas, so humorism, acupuncture, these kind of things that have continued on. And then we have maybe modern ideas, ones that are more pseudoscience, things like this entire giant industry of supplements, right? And so between all of these kinds of faith healing practices, there's going to be, as we try to map them out, I can't talk about every single one of these things in the course of, we can try in the 50 slides that are left. But essentially, if we try to map out a spectrum, I have already defined before in my own understanding of this idea between, let's say, a less responsible and a more responsible, maybe, faith healing topic. And this is my own biased perspective or whatever, but as I'm trying to map this whole thing out. So we might say, for example, on this kind of less responsible practice, I've said, like, say, making these kind of absolute physical claims. You're going to be cured of cancer if your faith is strong enough, right? Blaming the victim. Your faith wasn't strong enough. This kind of a thing. Bilking the victim. It's going to cost you a lot to get for this to happen. We can do it with all this electromagnetism, and you have to have all of these very expensive procedures. Telling the victim that they need to avoid actual medical treatment is a very, obviously, potentially very, very dangerous and irresponsible kind of faith healing. On the other side here, we talked about done in conjunction with actual medical treatment. I think emphasizing the spiritual nature of this as opposed to the physical part of it that Western medicine does so well. Not making those certain physical claims like you're going to be healed or no matter what. And I also think that not bilking is an important one. So definitely in our tradition, we're not allowed to charge for sacraments, of course. But anyway, whatever. People have to have a livelihood, but not bilking people. So that's one way we can kind of map out the difference in this broad spectrum of faith healing. But I think that in order to get it, we also have to have more complexity to our map. And so add another axis here, it's not just a spectrum, but maybe a whole plane. And so here we might say, on the one hand, there's a faith healer who fully believes in this practice that they are engaged in. And then at the opposite pole from that on the axis is a faith healer that is frankly knowingly a fraud. So they know what they're doing that is a fraud, right? And so one of those on that, you can have things like, for example, someone who is a believer in this kind of faith healing in general, but they maybe know as the practitioner, they're kind of the insider, they know that much of what the faith healer has to do is for a little bit of show. So it may well be that that actually, let's say a psychic or whatever really believes in being able to talk to ghosts and things like that, but still knows that some of what they have to do is a little bit of a show to get the other people to understand it, right? And so that may be that we might call that a pious fraud, as they still are a believer, but they are obviously more in the know than the others. And even higher on that might be that they're a believer, but they have just a significantly more nuanced view of what's going on than what they tell the regular believers, right? So the regular believers who are being healed maybe have a very simple and literalistic view, and the practitioner maybe has a much more sophisticated or nuanced view, and so it's on this pole, they're a believer, but not necessarily a full believer, right? So we then have, and there's kind of two different ways and two axes on which to plot these things, which is to say the less responsible practitioners, the more responsible practitioners, the ones who are full believers, the ones who are full frauds. And so we might say, your grandmother's folk remedy that she's going to give you when you're also experiencing treatment from the doctor and everything like that, but she just knows that this particular tea and taken in conjunction with this at this time of night is going to also be very efficacious, and she believes that, and it maybe, has always been that case. Yeah, chicken soup, I believe that. So anyway, I have that all the time. So anyway, that's a believer, and it's pretty responsible. It's not problematic. She's not charging you for that. She's doing that out of love. However, your crazy uncle, he may well advise you to skip chemo, and because his super food that he has stumbled upon is sure to be, you don't want to go through all of this horrible thing that the doctors want to do to you, because he can be cured of cancer by doing this other thing that is going to be so much less horrible. But might actually ultimately end up killing you because you didn't do your actual treatment. So less responsible. I'm going to say that this televangelist, who's a multimillionaire, who knows that he's staging a bunch of frauds often or planting people into the different mix, although some of them actually are, coming for actual healings. But he also, it's so very profitable, so he has a very big motive. So less responsible, not so much responsible that he's preventing people from getting actual treatment, but knows he's kind of a fraud and also is motivated especially to bilk people out of their money. And then over here, maybe there's a hypothetical healer who's maybe filling that role that Valerie was talking about, who knows maybe that a person has, let's say, maybe a psychosomatic illness and is either going to be doing something that they think, they will invoke that either placebo effect or they know that this kind of a healing or something like that, they're being told that and they'll believe that, and that maybe will alleviate psychosomatic symptoms as a result of that. And so that would be that the person knows that they're kind of committing a little bit of fraud with a pious intent, and maybe it's responsible to be doing that. I don't know. So that's kind of if we're kind of mapping those kind of faith healings out. But I'm going to suggest that maybe we need one more axis here to map the complexity of this tradition. And so I'm going to turn these ones on end. So we still have more responsible, less responsible, fraud healer, believing healer. And I'm also going to say that there is a big difference in the whole course of this as I was going through it between what sometimes is called like the little culture and what sometimes is called either big culture or high culture. And so there's a big difference between, a local faith practitioner, a healer, your grandmother, or somebody who has superstition individually, and a high tradition like acupuncture or something like that was once, for example, had its place anyway, and still probably has a pretty firm place at the top of the establishment in Chinese society. Same thing we can mention in Middle Ages, the church, in terms of these faith healings that happen at pilgrimage sites, right? So that would have been high culture. And so little culture, your peasant culture, is really, even though we have trouble even finding it and exploring it and things like that, because history is written not so much only by the victors, but by the rich. So the majority of the people, though, throughout time, the vast majority of the people have the lived experience of little culture, and it's generally speaking ignored by history because history has to be focused on the rich, the elite, high culture. But there have always been, let's say, local wise women, witches, shamans. There might be farmers who believe in various kinds of folk magic and remedies, what the high culture calls superstitions, that tend to be denigrated by sophisticates in the contemporary high culture. And so those would have been, back in the day, people like, on the one hand, the court physicians, the natural philosophers, and, for example, the clergy, the bishops and everyone. So if we're going to map those kind of things out on that axis, we have things like peasant, sympathetic magic, things that we were talking about, having an amulet or something like that, that is not part. Probably it's not anything in Quran that says to wear the amulet like that, but it's something that has become a folk practice. You think that if you wash the ink off and you drink the ink, this is it's sympathetic in the sense that now God's word, the Quran, is actually healing you, right? Witches, performing spells that are learned by a mentor. This is a little bit higher culture because it's actually being passed down from practitioner to practitioner, right? Even though it's, generally speaking, denigrated by the high culture, right? And so, at the height of witches, which is the early modern time period, they were also getting burned for practicing in the West. There's monks and nuns that have herbal remedies without having been very well trained, so at the low end of the clergy, a lot of folk stuff is going on. They're only participating so much in the higher culture. Above that, though, is more official stuff in the Middle Ages. For example, when you go on these kind of big showy pilgrimages and you're healed by a saint at a shrine that is controlled by a powerful bishop at their cathedral. And then even higher culture are these sorts of contemporary court natural philosophers and things like that, physicians who are making use of this very elaborated philosophical system, right? And so we can kind of see that other axis, which is at the time of this, that's not necessarily a faith healing, but as those become artifacts nowadays, if anybody is a humorist, if you're doing bloodletting, this is no longer the science. In the high culture, it's now an artifactual thing like acupuncture. It's a faith healing now, but it's one that is derived from high culture as opposed to one that's derived from the little culture.
Unless you're giving blood.
Unless you're giving blood, yeah. So what we can say, though, is like little culture continues, right? So we obviously, there's individual superstitions, as we might call them, denigrate them here, but then there's also all kinds of traditional healers in less developed or even indigenous societies and things like that. And then in among non-elites in Western society too, there'll be things like snake handlers, right? So that emerges not as something that the leader of the United Methodist Church ever told anybody to do, but rather, people in the backcountry who are Christians who read that if in the Isaiah thing that has the lion and the lamb that also has you can hold snakes and they won't and they won't bite you and everything like that, and you won't and so then this is a sign that fulfillment of God's word and everything like that, although they sometimes do get bitten by the snakes. But anyway, so it's a little culture kind of a practice. There's also then, as we mentioned, kind of these artifacts from old high culture that have continued. So humorism, acupuncture. There continued to be, as we saw, that shrine of Our Lady of Lourdes, large institutional religious healing that goes on. And we also then have kind of emerging in the middle, kind of it's not peasants, but it's not it's not the forefront of modern science or something like that. Things that have a pseudoscience bent to it, so industry stuff, and then also stuff that is popular stuff, so things like the crystals, New Age, that kind of a thing. And so that's maybe kind of in the middle between high and little culture. So I want to circle back around here and look at Jesus and the lepers. This again, looking now, having kind of made that map, having put this context into place, let's go back to this story. So we're in an era here, long before there was any, effective medicine. So 1900 years or whatever it would be, 1800 years before. And so what I'd suggest is if we take that story of Jesus and all of his healing that we saw, there's very little that we can definitively say about the historical Jesus. And so in terms of trying to map out the story on our multi-dimensional axes here, but what we can say, I think, almost certainly, is that he's down here. So as opposed to being part of the high culture as if he's not the court physician to the Emperor Augustus or something like that, and he is not the chief priest or something like that of the temple in Jerusalem. Instead, he is likely to say an itinerant preacher, miracle worker who's wandering around the peasant countryside of Galilee, right? So he's emerging, the historical Jesus anyway, emerges out of this peasant culture, little culture. So his hometown, which is one of those things that's multiply attested, and so therefore probably goes back to the actual historical Jesus, this town of Nazareth. It's just a little town of peasants. It's not known, it doesn't even exist in the historical record before the name Jesus of Nazareth actually makes it be written down for the first time. So it's probably, nobody would make up the idea that he's from Nazareth, right? Because as it even says in the gospel, can any good thing come out of Nazareth? And indeed, 2 of the gospel writers made up stories that he's from Bethlehem so that they could have it fulfill a prophecy that they prefer. So anyway, that's probably where he's from. Jesus himself is said to have been and sometimes we say a carpenter is how it's translated, but that means he's not actually building big houses or something. He's essentially making wooden bowls and fixing wooden tools and stuff. And so that, by the criterion of embarrassment, you don't necessarily want your son of God or whatever to just be a woodsmith or something, and so that may well be the case. We don't know, it's not for sure, but anyway, that's possible. It's peasant activity, though. And so there are perhaps, in sayings that are among the most attested sayings or best attested sayings, Jesus talks about establishing a heavenly kingdom on earth that belongs to the poor, where the first are last and the last are first. And often his parables are set in an agricultural setting, and they're about things like debt, which is the thing that all of these peasants are especially concerned of, because that's what's driving them off the land. Farmers are still having these kind of problems. So farmers in the United States are all going bankrupt because of this trade war right now. So debt is a huge thing, and all the way going back. So he's part of that cultural setting is what I'm suggesting, we can say. And so this is fitting something that fits very well into the little culture, which is to say faith healing. So I want to also make the point that prior to the modern era, people didn't make any distinction between the supernatural and the natural causes. And indeed, we have this word supernatural that's actually coined in modern times. It's a Neo-Latin word. It doesn't go back to Antiquity. All natural effects, as far as ancient people were concerned, had what we think of as a supernatural cause. The first cause was ultimately God, according to, or the source, the unmoved mover, however you want to phrase it in most ancient Greek philosophy. But in any event, there's intermediate causes where things like death and wind and any other kind of thing are understood to be as a force, that are a divine force, which is to say a God. And so there's no particular distinction. There may be additional causes past that in between. So Jesus and his peasant followers and most of their contemporaries then would have believed in faith healing, since that's happening all around them all the time, but lacking any autographic text. We have nothing that Jesus wrote himself, and indeed probably nothing from any eyewitnesses who knew Jesus. And so it's impossible to say definitively what the historical Jesus believed about himself and all of these sort of purported healings of the sick, blind, and the crippled. But what I want to suggest is, and this almost ties in, I think, with what Valerie even talked about with the psychosomatic healing, that although the perceived physical component of the healing would have been totally inseparable for ancient audiences, because they don't have this division that we have between natural and supernatural. Jesus' focus on healing and saving, which is essentially the same word in Greek here, outcasts. He's not only healing the blind, the crippled, but it's also other kinds of outcasts on the margins of society. So the poor, prostitutes, tax collectors who were breaking law and therefore couldn't be in Jewish society, other perceived sinners. That implies that there is a social dimension to how Jesus is perceiving or forwarding his vision of this kingdom that he's talking about. So when a person in Antiquity becomes an outcast from society, if you're in that peasant society and you do something horrible, you do something that's not allowed. You're breaking the sexual boundaries. You're sleeping with someone else's spouse. You have done something where accidentally, like manslaughter has happened or something like that. You've done something where you've said something that just can't be taken back, and you're simply cast kind of out of your village. There is no... you're not falling back on your savings. There's no social safety net. If you have something where you are temporarily ill and you're knocked out for a whole season and you lose your property and everything like that, and you have to go be a beggar for a while, as that coming out of that condition in Antiquity is not the easiest thing in the world. So because of all those things not existing. So healing then a ritual healing, or so one of those things, when you are having those things happen, that may have a psychosomatic perceived physical effect. The example in Quran that we heard is when Jacob thought his son is dead, his beloved son, he went blind. And so maybe he psychosomatically went blind, and so that kind of thing happens. And so what happens then at a pivotal moment is that there can be a ritual healing. Those symptoms cease to occur, or you cease to feel like they're happening. You can go from madness if you were possessed, and now you have recovered from your madness. That allows the person during that healing moment, that public thing that happens, and so everything is a public performance. It is not a literary society where you're writing things down and now you're in this condition and now you're that. The doctor says you're okay and go home, and he signs a form and you're released. You have to go through a public ceremony or ceremonial for anything to happen and have meaning in an oral and an ancient demonstrative society. So when you go through a ritual healing, then you cross that threshold and can be welcomed back into the society from which you've been outcast for whatever reason. So that, I think, is also then a core component of what ritual healing continued to mean throughout the Middle East, certainly too, but also through the Christian West. And so, for example, in the case that we had with Canterbury here and all these medieval pilgrims, some of them, sure, had very real physical ailments for which they hoped, maybe beyond hope, for a physical cure, but many others would have been outcasts for breaching some social norm, and they might have had penances imposed on them, and they went on this pilgrimage, they went to the shrine, they prostrated themselves before the saint, and they're healed, and then they're able to come back into the society now having gone through that healing. And this is even be quite explicit for example, if you're a knight and you had just done something horrible in the course of a war that you're having, and you, let's say, burned a church down with all the people inside it, which happened all the time, then if they were to do that, then they would, they might have to, let's say, go on a crusade and live as a crusader for 18 years or something like that, and then they would be, that penance would be lifted and they could come back to the society, right? So when they're declared healed at the saint's shrine, then they're ready to be reinvited into the society. So let's sum up, and then we can get back to our discussion. So we have our graph. That's how we try to go through this vast subject. So whereas I think we're rightly view much contemporary faith healing with some healthy skepticism, nevertheless, there's a lot of contemporary faith healing that we should be very aware of our bias and tendency to disparage non-elite culture, so little culture as it continues to exist. We may privilege academic and well-informed and scientifically accurate culture and everything like that. Nevertheless, in a lot of cases, little culture has tradition with very deep roots that is very deeply experienced by the people who are part of it. And so we should, anyway, be aware of that. Our bias, and finally, we should be especially cautious, I think. This is the first time I've used like a modern movie picture for Jesus as these images try to make things especially literalistic. It's a cute movie, Jesus, though. Anyway, we should be especially cautious of imposing our modern lenses like literalism, supernaturalism, historicism onto stories, that are from antiquity that were told with very, very different paradigms and understandings in the original telling. And that is my take on ritual healing and belief in miracles.